I'm Allie with Potomac Beads. Join me in making this stellar necklace featuring some of the donut or the cosmic rings in the Potomac Crystals. Remember, if you need any supplies, check out the links below me to shop with us online at Potomac Beads. To begin the piece, we're going to start with our largest cosmic circle, which is going to be the 20 millimeter, and I'm using the blue emerald color of the cosmic rings in the 14, the 20, and the 8. So we're going to start with the 20, which is going to be the one that hangs down at the bottom. I also have some crystal drops here in the 6x9 and then some tinies in the 3x5, as well as some 3 millimeter bicones. And what we're going to do is we are going to basically create kind of a waterfall of crystals. This can be up to you how many you want to do, how few you want to do, and kind of how do you want to make that fringe. We're going to begin by making a strip of peyote along the bottom of the piece and then waterfalling these crystals down from it to create a cluster. I want to make my peyote strip 4 beads wide, so I'm going to begin by putting 4 of my Duracoat galvanized silver in my Delica on my thread and dropping it down to the base of about a 4-foot piece of thread. This is way more thread than you need, but you'll need a bunch for the connection. I'm going to grab another 15-0 and I'm going to turn the thread back over itself. So my thread end is at the top of my hand here. I'm going to be sewing now towards that top, holding the thread to the bottom. I'm going to skip through bead number 4 and sew through bead number 3. If you want to add a stop bead, you could do that as well. Give a nice tight pull so this sit kind of right on top of one another. From here, I'm going to add another bead, another Delica, and sew through bead number 1, the one that's kind of closest there to the end. Give it a nice little tight pinch if you don't have a stop bead there, and make sure you have your nice little peyote section. From here, we're going to continue with our peyote rows to make a band to go the whole way around the cosmic ring, adding 1 bead at a time and 2 per row. So you add 1 Delica and then another Delica. That completes my 3rd row. 4th row, same thing, 1 bead, sew through the one sticking up, add another bead, sew through the one sticking up. When you give a nice tight pull at each row, make sure that your beads are sitting nice and in line with the previous row. I'm going to continue doing these rows of peyote stitch until we get ready to add them and seam around the crystal, so we're getting ready for our drops. Once you have approximately 26 rows, and you want to make sure to have an even amount of rows on the peyote stitch, you want to go through the cosmic ring, and I have the 2 thread ends together here, and I'm going to get ready to seam them up and close that ring around close the loop around the ring. You want to make sure, again, you have that even amount because you want them to fit together perfectly, kind of like a link there. I'm coming out of my last row of my peyote stitch, and I'm going to go into my 1st row on the opposite side. Zigzagging this together, I'm going to go into the 1st bead on the opposite side and then the 2nd bead on that 1st side. Back into that 1st bead there. And you're basically sewing back from one side to the other. You can see that's going to seam it nice and closed. And what I'm going to do, because I'm hanging the fringe, normally I would kind of weave this back through. I'm just going to tie these 2 thread ends together. Getting rid of the 1 thread. Kind of burning it down just so it doesn't get mixed in, but I don't want to burn it down too small that it clogs a hole. That's going to get my loop around the bottom of my ring. Now what I'm going to do is decorate with this piece of thread and needle. So I'm going to go back into that Delica that my thread kind of was coming out of, the one right below it, and sew through. So that way my thread and needle is coming out between my 1st and my 2nd kind of row of beads. What I'm going to do here is drop down a couple Delicas. Don't overthink it. Drop down a crystal. We're just going to make clusters. Take one of my new crystal drops, drop a Delica after it. Take my thread and needle, go back up through the drop, back up through that 2 millimeter bead, and back through all the Delicas. Give a nice tight pull so you have extra thread kind of out of there that you don't see it. Sew through next row of your peyote stitch, And we're gonna end up sewing through about 4 rows of the stitch as we go in and kind of add these drop downs. You're gonna continue to add the drop downs in varying lengths and varying beads. So this one I'm gonna do 4 down. Grab my little blue drop there, that metallic blue iris to go with the zircon. Grab a Delica to hold it in the bottom. And back up through, skipping the Delica at the bottom. That's gonna be how we get all of our drops working as fringe. Sewing out to the side then, through that Delica stitch. I have 2 beads on, right there in the row. Off to the side, I'm gonna add some beads also, so they hang down. Adding in maybe 3 beads, another one of the big beads, another Delica. And literally you're just gonna keep sewing back in along the stitch here to add in more beads. So as you stitch back in along the row, you're gonna get this fuller and fuller cluster. You can see where I'm coming out there on the peyote stitch, adding in more. Maybe this one goes shorter. Another Delica, another short one. If you want to, you can also use some permalac along the back of these cosmic rings, so that way the silver backing does not come off as you're working with it. And that you want to apply and do prior to adding this peyote stitch along the edge. So again, give a nice tight pull. There's another piece of the fringe. Sew through another piece of the peyote stitch there right afterwards. And add in another. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down about 20 different drops coming off of my 20mm cosmic ring. So I ended up getting a little drop happy, and I ended up doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 different little drop downs on the piece. You can also see this is fun just to have as a pendant on its own. What we're going to do now is basically start connecting our sides, which is very easy. If you want to, you can also add crystals up it. What I'm going to do is reinforce and kind of sew along my peyote stitch line. You can see my 1 thread end there. And I'm going to sew right along that edge of my peyote. Sew back in through this stitch a couple times. Going right along the thread end. Taking my thread and needle to the back of the peyote stitch then, I'm going to burn down the edge of this thread and needle. Now you'll notice I have a ton of extra thread and needle on. That is because I am going to get ready to connect all of my different cosmic rings together. So again, after you kind of have that stitch there, go in with your thread burner, and this piece you can completely disconnect, burning down those thread edges. You'll notice I'm using the Wildfire Green 0.006 thread, which is great because you really cannot see it in conjunction with my green and blue kind of theme going along here. So there is the end then of that connection piece. And now what we're going to do is connect it into the side pieces. I've already done one of the sides, doing that connection. We're going to connect to the side, and then I'll show you how we're going to bring it all together with a really, really nice, simple, just loop of seed beads. As I build and connect to the sides, we're going to progress from basically 4 beads on our drop to a 2 row of peyote to then our single just strung beads. I've already started this row here, and remember we have about 26, I think my count was. So I'm going to do 26 rows. I started with 2 beads, and I'm just adding 1, sewing into the other. So this is as simple as peyote can get. Add 1 bead, sew into the other. So we went from doing a 4 rows of peyote to just 2 rows of our peyote stitch. And again, I'm going to do about 26 of these. Now, if you want to, you can get really, really creative and have fun and decorate these too so that it hangs down kind of next to it, or even decorate the other cosmic rings. Keep it as simple or as complex as you want. Adding in 1 bead, sewing down. You'll notice every other bead you're sewing up versus sewing down. So again, 26 rows, and all I'm going to do after the 26 rows is seam the 2 rings together. So I'm going to go from the first ring to the second ring, also a 20mm cosmic ring. Once you have, and I apologize, I said 26, not thinking it needs to go around both rings. Once you have about 40 rows of your peyote stitch, you're going to seam the 2 together just like you did when you were adding the fringe. So I'm going to go back to the opposite side And after kind of putting them through, you can see that peyote, that long peyote band there hanging out the bottom. I'm going to sew through bead number 1 on the opposite side, seaming them together to be a seamless unit. Coming back then, sew through the second bead on the second side, zigzagging them together. I am going to go back in this one since I'm not adding any fringe, and I'm going to sew on a diagonal through the first 2 rows at the very beginning. So I'm going back here. I'm going to sew through 1 bead and 2 beads on that diagonal. When I sew through that 2 beads on that diagonal, it just pieces that peyote stitch together. You can see here as I pull it together, nice and tight. You want to make sure that your rings sit next to one another and they're not overlapping. So you have that 2 rows there of the peyote stitch. And what I'm going to do is sew back into the peyote stitch a little bit, kind of reinforcing that edge. And then I'll burn down and get rid of that thread start. So I'm just going to go on the diagonal there from one side to the other side, making sure again that this starter piece is kind of pulled tightly there and seaming up those 2 ends together. What I will do on this piece here of peyote is I'm going to make sure that the thread ends are not ending in the same spot as I go in and draw these 2 ends together. I will take this peyote stitch then and this little connection point. What I will do is move it to the back of the piece. After I have that connection piece finished and reinforced a couple times, I'll go back and burn those 2 thread edges. So I have the first ring connected to the second, and now I have to connect the third ring to the first as well. So you're going to do a second strip of peyote, the exact same length, those 40 beads long, and add the 2 together. So that way you have your third cosmic ring linked to the first 2. While the original piece was 26 rows of the peyote stitch, the side connectors were 40. The next one is going to be 34, connecting the 20 millimeter down to that 14 millimeter. So same thing, I have the peyote stitch underneath, have the thread ends coming out the same side of my piece, and I'm just going to sew from one to the other. Once I have this on one side, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, linking the 2 together. The reason the count is changing for the peyote stitch is because as we get smaller, the cosmic rings are thinner. So the smaller the ring, the thinner the cosmic ring is. That's why there is a deviation in the number of beads along the sides from 40 to that 34. Just like before then, we go through and we seam up the sides on that peyote stitch, reinforcing, bringing the ends out in separate sections and linking on. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. I just have it temporarily held together with 1 row. Do the same thing on the other side, and then 1 more link on here. So we went from that 26 to 40 to 34, and now we're going to drop down to 30 as we link the 2 smaller ones together of the same size. When you get to the back, what we want to do is split that peyote stitch as we add on our smallest of our 8 millimeter rings. I have a strip of peyote here that is 20 long, and I'm going to take that around the last 14 millimeter cosmic ring, going in and connecting the peyote ends, one to the other like we've been doing, so no big surprise there. Starting out on one side, coming out the left side, so I'm going to go into the right side, so back over to the left, and then group back over to the first bead on the right and sew on a diagonal through the opposite way. What that does is that links up those 2 sides and makes that seamless piece of peyote stitch. From here, what we're going to do is come out of the stitch and do ladder stitch on 2 sides. That's 8 beads long. So I'm going to take 1 bead coming out of that side bead, go back into the bead that my thread is coming out of from the middle towards the outer edge, and that is my first bead in my ladder stitch. Go back through the bead that you just added and out you come. Add a bead, number 2, back through the bead in a circle that you just came through, and then back through the bead that you just added. That's 2. I'm going to add 8 on, and then we're going to connect our first ring. We're going to end up doing this 2 times as we connect 2 rings and then build that into the 1 ring and do our long peyote strip for our connector in the back. So I have 4 on, just kind of showing how I'm doing this, coming out the top of the Delica, adding a Delica, sewing into the bottom, out through the top, and from the top to the bottom of the one that you just added. So there are 4 new beads in that ladder stitch. I need to make it to 8. Once we make it to 8, we're going to round it out, connect it back to the center here, and add in my 8mm ring. Now that I have 8 beads on my ladder stitch, I'm going to sew through my cosmic ring in the 8mm so that I'm coming out through the top. Let that ladder stitch go on in. And I'm going to take the ladder stitch here, that 8th bead, and I'm going to sew into the bead of the peyote stitch that my thread is coming out of when I started that 8 bead ladder stitch. That's going to round out this ladder stitch, go back into the thread and the bead that you were just coming out of, and that's going to finish off that 1 cosmic ring. Take your thread and needle back to the base peyote and sew through 1 bead that your thread was coming out of, and then straight across to the next bead in line. Go ahead and repeat that ladder stitch with another 8 beads, doing the same thing, adding on 8 beads and then sewing in your next cosmic ring so you have 2 that kind of present themselves almost in the look of a zipper. So we've gone over ladder stitch, going and adding the 2 along the sides here and splitting that like a zipper. What we're going to do now is add a 3rd ring, one of the smaller ones, to the top. I have an independent ladder stitch piece that is 10 beads long. So just going around doing those figure 8s into 10 beads length. What we're going to do is we're going to put that through one of our, I'm putting the tail through one of the cosmic rings. And then I'm going to put the needle from the bottom towards the top, because you always kind of want the crystals facing one another so they face the right way, onto the thread. Coming over now, my thread is coming out the top of this Delica bead. I'm going to go into the top of the Delica bead on the other side, which would be bead 1 that I added to the ladder stitch. Seaming them together just like we've been doing, then going back into that bead that my thread is coming out of, that last bead or that 10th bead in the row. When I pull that together, it is going to make a nice and tight seamless ladder stitch row. I'm going to take my thread end and just do 1 simple little knot with the thread end as well as with the needle and thread that I'm still using. From here, I want to add 2 beads onto my ladder stitch because I want to combine the piece here so that it sits in a triangle. To do so, coming out of the side of that ladder stitch, ignoring the knot, I want you to pick up 2 additional Delica beads. So this is kind of a lesson in ladder stitch as well as this is now square stitch that you're doing, adding kind of a second row to it. Go back 1 bead, so to that first bead in the peyote stitch, I'm coming out the 10th bead, or sorry, in the ladder stitch, and I'm going to go back to bead number 1 after adding 2 beads and sew through. Make sure those 2 beads kind of sit off to the side like that, one on top of the other. Go back through bead number 10 in the ladder stitch and bead number 1 that you put in that group of 2. They should line up right next to one another. Going in now, I'm going to go down to bead number 2 that I just put on, and I'm coming out between bead number 2 from the second row of ladder stitch and bead number 1. Add on now 8 additional beads into the ladder stitch, adding a bead, going into the opposite side of the bead your thread is coming out of, making sure that folds over top of the last bead nicely, because the nicer your ladder stitch sits, the nicer it'll look. And then going back through the bead that you just came out of, or you just added. There's basically 3 beads now in my ladder stitch. I need to make a total of 10. So I have 7 more beads to add, and then we're going to seam the 2 ends together as we get this nice triangular look. Once the 10th bead is on that ladder stitch, I want you to sew through that open cosmic ring, which for mine is on the left-hand side. Make sure that ladder stitch doesn't have any turns in it anywhere and sits correctly. See how it has that slight turn in it? Just kind of rotate it so that way it's sitting nicely. Also, if you need to change the direction one of the beads is facing just so it sits nicer and then it's not twisted, go ahead and do that as you're working with it. You can just kind of stick that needle through. Once you have it sitting and cooperating, you are going to come to the back of the project, find that first bead. It's a little bit hard to see because you're going through the middle, and you're going to take your needle and thread out through the front. My needle and thread is coming out from the left-hand side of that bead when I'm facing the back, or towards the interior. I'm going to make sure that the last bead in that ladder stitch row, bead number 1, I am going to go through from the interior to the exterior. Take your thread and needle to the back of the project, and then go back through that same bead in that ladder stitch form that your thread was coming out of. Give a nice tight pull, and that tightens it up, so that way when you're looking at it here, you have those nice rows of ladder stitch and that nice triangular sit for my actual clasp portion or my cord portion, which we're going to do with that same simple peyote stitch attached to the end. Now that you are getting ready to add to the end, what I've done is created a ladder stitch and then gone in and done a 2-ring peyote on the opposite side, attaching a button in that jet AB full on the end. We're going to do the same thing on the other side, but creating a little loop. So I've gone ahead and done a ladder stitch piece that is 8 beads long, and I'm going to go in and seam those together. So I'm going to put that around that last cosmic ring. And remember, with all of this, you can really stop at any time and with any ring combination, or even add more. So I'm going in and I'm seaming this together nice and tight. Going to take that thread end there and knot it to the thread that's still attached once and twice. And then I'm going to take my needle and thread through basically the bead that is next to the knot that points up at the top. From here, we're going to add 2 beads, which are going to start our 2-strand or our 2-wide peyote stitch. I'm going back into that same bead that my thread is coming out of, just like if I was ladder stitching 2 beads together. Naturally, one bead's going to kind of fall down to the side, go through one of those 2 beads and come out. Add in another bead, and sew through that bead that sits kind of in that V in that group of 2 that you added. From here, go back through that bead that you just added after putting on one more Delica and going through it. You're now in the rotation where you have bead on, sew through a bead, add a bead, sew through a bead, and so forth. So you're going to continue up till you get approximately 5 to 6 inches of your peyote stitch if you want it to sit at that 18 to 16 inch range. So keep going, and I'll show you how I'm going to do the loop for the other side of the clasp. Once you have the end of the rope done, what I've gone through is separated, so come out between those 2 beads in the last of that 5-inch rope, and I've done ladder stitch for a number of beads to go around the button that I'm using. Once you're done with that loop that it's going to fit around the button, you want to make sure it's kind of sitting straight, and we want to curve it in towards the center there, and I'm going to go in from my bead wherever it's going through, whether or not it's the front or the back here, and connect these 2 beads together in that same ladder stitch form. So go back here, create that ladder stitch, and that's another way basically to do kind of that zipper connection when you're looking at it. If you want to, along the base here, when you're or along the actual chain portion towards the back, if you want to, keep in mind you could have switched your thread to the wildfire gray color. That way you wouldn't see the green on the sides. It does not bother me at all to see that green. But just in case you don't like that thread end, you can also jazz it up a little bit by putting a Charlotte or a 15-0C bead along the side. You can see now what I'm doing to end the thread is just sewing back into the project along that peyote in a zigzag line, bringing my thread out between the 2, changing the direction then just for an additional added feature. Sew down a little bit further down the peyote stitch, and then once I'm down about 1 inch, I'm just going to take my thread zap or my thread burner and burn down that thread end. Go through the project then as you finish it off and burn down any extra thread ends or any connections that you've had to do. It's like the last thing I do is kind of look at all those little connection spots, see and make sure that they are good to go, and then you have your necklace completed. Thanks so much for joining me in making this stellar necklace. Remember, there's so many different variations you can do, whether or not you do ladder stitch throughout, peyote stitch, go ahead and just do 3, connect chain in the back. It's really an idea, sort of a project. Remember, if you need any materials to make the stellar necklace or something like it, check out the links below to shop with us online at PotomacBeads. Remember, you can also click that little bell in the corner to subscribe to get regular updates from us here at PotomacBeads. In addition to that, make sure to comment and share below any ideas or questions or changes or modification that you made to help this beading community become better. As always, thanks so much for joining and enjoy your own stellar necklace.